This is KSL Sunday Edition with Boyd Matheson.
Welcome to Sunday Edition. I am Boyd Matheson. Each Sunday we attempt to divide the rage from the reason, elevate the conversation, connect the dots, and make the news make sense. We have conversations with great thinkers, great leaders, and great people making a difference. We talk politics so we can discuss society, and we explore society so we can discuss principles and the people in America who live them. We bring the best and brightest to Utah, and we send the Utah model to our nation's capital and beyond. A few weeks ago, we had Chuck Todd, longtime moderator of Meet the Press, joined us here on Sunday Edition as he prepared to pass the baton to the new moderator, Kristen Welker. Today, Kristen stepped into the chair, picked up the torch, and is poised to lead a new season of crucial conversations on the set of Meet the Press. Kristen brings extraordinary journalistic experience, a rich sense of the role of the press in American history and democracy, and above all, Kristen is a reporter's reporter in pursuing transparency and truth while fostering more meaningful dialogue. Kristen, welcome to Sunday Edition.
Boyd, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that beautiful introduction. I really appreciate it. It's great to be with you.
Well, we are very excited about this new season on Meet the Press. Give us kind of your feelings going in. Obviously, a long-time brand and legacy to be upheld. What are you looking at as you roll in on Meet the Press?
Well, you talked about my predecessor, Chuck Todd. He was my mentor. He taught me so much about political journalism, so I will be taking the baton from him, hoping to build on everything he achieved. He really grew and expanded the show. And of course, I want to build on the great legacy of the show. And I think the way to do that is to make sure that we're staying true to the core principles of the show, making sure we're holding our elected officials to account. But also, I want to make sure that I'm keeping my finger on the pulse of the voter. We are heading into that critical election cycle, as you mentioned, and I am going to be approaching this role as a reporter. And so I want to bring all of that to our viewers on Sunday to make sure that we are giving them new and relevant and important information.
Yeah, so important. And I do think what you bring from your reporting background, years on Capitol Hill, at the White House in particular, over multiple administrations, left and right. Give us a sense of what you're hoping the conversations will be. You'll obviously have a few sparks fly here and there, but how do you hope to elevate the conversation? What do you hope people walk away from Meet the Press each Sunday?
I hope they walk away with new information. I think you really hit the nail on the head. We want to make sure that these conversations are educational and informative to our viewers. That's really the goal here, that people at home walk away and say, I heard about that issue that we talked about at the dinner table. I learned a little something new that I didn't know before. So that is a huge challenge, and I take that responsibility very, very seriously. And so in order to do that, look, I'm going to be out on the campaign trail. I'm going to be talking to voters. What do they care about? What are the issues they want me to ask about? I'm sitting in that chair on behalf of them, and I take that responsibility very, very seriously.
You enter the chair and you take the stage at a time when trust in institutions, trust in media is really at all-time lows. How do you hope to get to the truth, hold people accountable, as you said, and build that trust, not just in the institution of journalism and the media, but actually how we have trust in each other as citizens and as a society?
Boy, I learned so many of the fundamentals of that question that you're asking me during my time in local news. I spent more than a decade in local news, and I learned about the fundamentals of journalism. And so I think right now is a time to get back to the fundamentals of journalism, make sure that we're getting it right, make sure that we're accurate. If we make a mistake, saying so, owning up to that, and moving forward. And hopefully there won't be any mistakes, but also keeping true to that sense of community. That's a core part of being a local reporter, and it's something that I've brought with me as a White House correspondent, someone who covers Washington politics, just making sure that I am keeping that word community front and center. And again, how do we make sure we're bringing relevant and critical and important information to our viewers, to the community around us every Sunday?
Fantastic. Kristen Welker, fresh off her maiden voyage as moderator of Meet the Press. We look forward to being the after conversation for you here on Sunday Edition each week. And when we come back, we will look ahead to how serious or unserious Congress is going to be about doing their job and avoiding a government shutdown when Sunday Edition continues on KSL TV. Welcome back to Sunday Edition. Members of the House of Representatives, the Senate, and President Joe Biden all returned to Washington, D.C. this week. Looming on the horizon just 13 days away is September 30th, the designated day and annual deadline for Congress to fulfill its legislative duty to fund the government and avoid a shutdown. We've become all too familiar and accustomed to the politics of the shutdown showdown. I'm a passionate believer that never in the history of ever should there be a threat of a government shutdown. Now, here to help us understand why and what Congress should be doing, we turn to one of my favorite sources in Washington, D.C., James Wallner, a senior fellow at the R Street Institute. He's the former director of the Republican Steering Committee in the United States Senate and one of the foremost experts on the inner workings of the Senate and Congress. During my time in Washington, I simply relied on James as the sage of the Senate. James, welcome to Sunday Edition.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so for our viewers, let's kind of do a little tee up here. We have this shutdown showdown looming at the end of the month. Why are we in this situation once again?
Well, we often make things harder than they are in all walks of life, and that certainly seems to be the case on Capitol Hill and in the House and Senate when it comes to government funding. The reason why we are staring down the possibility of a government shutdown is because the House and Senate haven't appropriated the money needed to keep the government open. They haven't done their job. Instead, they seem to be focused more on finger pointing and blaming the other side or the other chamber, as the case may be.
So it is one of the very few duties outlined in the Constitution is the funding of the government. You mentioned these appropriations bills. Walk us through what should that look like in a regular year?
Well, this is one of the most important duties that the federal government has. And every year, they have to pass 12 appropriations bills. They can pass them individually, or they can combine them in various forms and pass them together. But ultimately, they do need to pass them. And these fund things like the Department of Transportation, the Department of Treasury, the Department of Education, and I think most significantly, the Department of Defense. And if Congress doesn't fund these departments, if they don't first approve the money, then you can't take it out of the Treasury and use it, even if it's there, according to the Constitution.
And so as we break it down now, obviously Congress has not done their job. Once again, this has become a habit, regardless of whether the Democrats or Republicans are in control of Congress or the White House. We just seem to be in this perpetual loop on this. And so give us some perspective in terms of what do you expect to see in the coming 13 days as we march towards that looming date?
There's going to be a lot of high-stakes showdowns. I think the press are going to get increasingly more hyperbolic when it comes to covering this story. And the reason why is because all of the action is going to take place behind closed doors. They're going to take place in negotiations between Majority Leader Schumer in the Senate and in the Speaker, Kevin McCarthy, in the House. They're going to take place between the Appropriations Committee chairman. And that's where you're going to figure out what ultimately is going to happen at the end of the month. And if they can negotiate a deal that everybody can agree to in the House, or at least 218 House members, and enough senators can agree to it to surpass it, then it will go forward. But my guess is we're looking at a CR, a continuing resolution, to buy them even more time to negotiate at the end of the month.
So let's get into that issue of the continuing resolution. It's one that we're going to hear a lot about that will kind of continue the funding of the government. Just explain that a little bit for our viewers in terms of what is that continuing resolution? What does it do? What does it not do? And why is it problematic?
So again, if Congress doesn't pass these 12 appropriations bills, then the funding for those bills can't go forward. And so therefore the program's shut down. At the end of September, what Congress has done, and this has been a regular occurrence now, certainly since I was in Washington and even before that, is that they pass a continuing resolution, which is an appropriations bill. But what it does is it continues funding at current levels for all of the programs affected by the inability of Congress to pass these appropriations bills. And those continuing resolutions are typically going to be stopgap measures. They're going to last for a couple of months, and most of them go till December or maybe in mid-November. And then they can also be a year-long continuing resolution, but that's something that the executive branch isn't a big fan of because it doesn't allow them to make adjustments that they feel they need to make because they have to stick with the same level of funding for each of their individual programs. But the continuing resolution is really Congress's way of saying we can't get our job done, so we're going to give ourselves more time to try to do that.
So the continuing resolution that is supposed to just keep funding continuing at current levels, but as you and I both know, that's rarely the case. It's usually continuing plus, usually in the tune of billions of extra dollars. Give us some perspective in terms of what else and then what the impact that is ultimately on the economy, on our national debt, and our deficit spending.
Well, your viewers are going to hear the term clean CR a lot. And a clean CR is simply a CR that continues everything at last year's levels. That doesn't exist. I've never seen that. They always make changes. They make changes to policy. They make changes to funding levels of various programs. But these aren't wholesale changes that you would see in a regular appropriations bill. But they still are going to be changes. I think a CR in and of itself is not a good way to proceed for the economy because it is extremely uncertain. I think the economy needs certainty, and having the constant threat looming of a government shutdown, I think, is not a very good thing when you're trying to run a business, for instance. But ultimately, if you keep spending like we've been spending in Washington for decades now, and it's just a question of how much more we're going to spend, not necessarily how much less we're going to spend, then we're going to continue to drive up our deficit. We're going to continue to drive up our debt, and we're going to find ourselves in this exact same place next year because the members of Congress are unwilling to adjudicate the differences that Americans have when it comes to what we should be spending our tax dollars on.
We often say that you can only get $32 trillion in debt through conflict, not through compromise. Actually, it's the compromise component that's the problem. And so often, and you've seen this, that we get to the end of the time, a big bill, thousands of pages are thrown together, nobody's had a chance to read it, and then it's an all or nothing vote. You either have to approve all of the spending or none of the spending and shut it down. How do we get past that in terms of the way Congress is functioning so we don't have these late night bills that nobody's read that end up driving that $32 trillion even more?
Well, the late night bills that nobody's read are by design. The Senate leaders in particular, but also the House leaders, they wait until the last minute and they put everything together and they confront their members with a fait accompli, Democrat and Republican alike. And it's vote for everything or oppose everything and risk shutting the government down or risk not funding something that you support. And this approach helps them pass things that members would rather not pass. It also allows members to talk out of both sides of their mouth. They can say, well, I'm not really a big fan of this program, but I had to vote for this bill because the consequences of not doing so would be devastating. It allows them to talk out of both sides of their mouth. But ultimately, you're exactly right. This trajectory, this pattern we find ourselves stuck in, this rut, if you will, comes from our inability to adjudicate our differences. The Senate right now can't have an appropriations debate because they can't agree on what amendments they want to allow. And they don't want to allow some amendments. And so therefore they say no amendments if we can't get a consent request to say what amendments we're going to consider. And so it's that inability to work through our conflict and then ultimately compromise that leads us to these positions where we find ourselves with our back against the wall and an omnibus appropriations bill staring us in the face.
Just in our last minute here, James, what's the one thing you're going to be watching in the coming days that we should be watching, maybe a little under the radar as we approach the end of the month?
Well, when you're looking at the end of the month and trying to figure out what's going to happen, I would look at vehicles, right? What vehicle can move that they can add stuff to, right? There's a supplemental spending bill for Ukraine right now that the president wants and a lot of members of Congress want. Well, if you want to figure out if that can pass, you need to look for a vehicle. Maybe an omnibus spending bill or a CR is a vehicle for that. And so looking at what are the must-pass items that are going to attract other things that are kind of slightly below the radar, and then like a farm bill extension, for instance. And then lastly, what chamber are they going to begin in? And if you start in the Senate, for instance, where it seems to be much more favorable to passing a CR without cuts, then it might allow them to jam the House a little bit more easily instead of waiting on the House to start and sending it over to the Senate. So I think those two things will help your viewers better decode what's happening in Washington behind closed doors.
All right, and it is behind closed doors that we always get into trouble. James Wallner from the R Street Institute, thanks for joining us today. Great perspective as we look at what is coming up. And as I say, if the members of Congress don't want to do the job that's outlined in the Constitution, we should help them look for jobs other places. All right, coming up, as it is Constitution Day today, we'll continue our month-long focus on America's founding and founders and the United States Constitution. We'll explore why a journey back on the road to Philadelphia might actually be the best path forward for our nation. Stay with us. More in Sunday Edition on KSL TV coming up next. Welcome back to Sunday Edition. In 1773, a group of Americans had it with King George's government. It was too big, too expensive, and too intrusive. What would become known as the Boston Tea Party became a clarion call and a cry against the kind of government the colonists simply did not want. But had those founding Americans stopped at protesting against the kind of government they didn't want, the Boston Tea Party would not have been even a footnote in history. It would have been just one more angry protest against a big, oppressive government. Fortunately for all of us, the founders of this nation marched forward from Boston and their protest against the government they didn't want on a journey toward the kind of government they did want. Now, that journey took them 14 long years to get from Boston to Philadelphia, where in 1787 they created in the Constitution the kind of government they did want. Boston to Philadelphia. That's a good model for us to follow today. Protest must be transformed from populist grievances in order to lead to progress and better days for the nation. Political battles often get bogged down in Bostonian kinds of battles, where principles and policies actually raise our gaze to the principles of Philadelphia. Those Philadelphia principles and policies will lead us ultimately to the kind of government, the kind of communities, and the kind of country we do want. I helped Utah Senior Senator Mike Lee craft a speech he delivered on this Boston to Philadelphia theme back in 2012. The senator rightly stated, however justified, frustration is not a platform. Anger is not an agenda. Outrage, resentment, and intolerance are un-American. For us, optimism is not just a message, it's a principle, an important principle. So the question for all of us on this Constitution Day is, how will we know we're on the right road from Boston to Philadelphia? Well, the actual road itself actually contains the answer. When the postal system was originally created under the direction of Benjamin Franklin, they placed stone markers along the road to show the postal riders how many miles to the next city. There are literally thousands of these markers still scattered across the Northeast even today. Many of the markers have engraved on the back a capital M, the word to, T-O, and a capital P, M to P. It stood for miles to Philadelphia. And the number, of course, represented the miles left on the journey to that city, which was at that time the heartbeat of the nation. We must rediscover and pursue the path to Philadelphia and learn to recognize the mile markers that will help us know we are indeed traveling the right road from protesting the kind of government we don't want to creating together the one that we do. Marker number 1 is found on the high road of elevated dialogue. America's always at its best when we are a nation of big ideas forged in an open, roiling, but respectful debate about how we can truly meet the challenges of our day. That debate invites all perspective, conservative and liberal alike, and elevates the best principles and policies in the marketplace of ideas. The high road of better conversations leads to the higher ground of common ground. Marker number 2 on the road to Philadelphia is getting past polarization through shared service. It is time to fill the seemingly gaping hole in the middle of the two major political parties. I'm convinced that hole is precisely the size and shape of shared service. Working side by side in the aftermath of a storm, fire, or flood is transformational. Coming together to mourn a tragedy, help a neighbor, or lift the less fortunate is uniting. And volunteering to coach the young, honor the elderly, or restore dignity to the disadvantaged connects our humanity and reminds us that we're all fellow travelers. This past week, tens of thousands of citizens across the state of Utah and millions across the country participated in the 9/11 Day of Shared Service. Blue and red, liberal and conservative, Democrat and Republican identities disappear on the road to Philadelphia. Now, marker number 3 on our journey to Philadelphia is restoring trust in institutions and in each other. America has been stress tested in world wars, economic collapse, and pandemic, but we've never stress tested our constitutional republic in the absence of trust. It's the duty of every citizen to be trustworthy and to hold elected officials accountable to living up to the principles they profess to believe. Political battles undermine trust in our institutions and ultimately erode trust in our neighbors. Trust is earned one honest interaction and conversation at a time. It's a long march from Boston to Philadelphia, and make no mistake, there are more Boston battles ahead, and we the people must always be ready to stand up and speak out against the kind of government we do not want. Likewise, we must always have the vision of Philadelphia before us, a vision and an agenda for the type of government and the kind of country we do want. Moving forward, we'll pass those mile markers, which will elevate conversations, fill the current divide in our political parties, and solve the current crisis of trust in our nation. We'll also pass other markers on the road to Philadelphia as we enact policies that will increase upward mobility for those struggling at the bottom end of the economic ladder, reduce the unfair advantages that prop up the wealthy and well-connected at the top, and create security for hardworking Americans everywhere in between. In today's political climate, the road to Philadelphia has unfortunately become the road less traveled. As a nation, we have a rendezvous with destiny in the days ahead that is dependent on each of us doing our part to promote freedom, pursue excellence, and serve the suffering, and leave our own markers for future generations to follow. It's time for all of us to pursue this journey from protest to progress, from Boston to Philadelphia. As Americans pursuing a Philadelphia vision, each of us has promises to keep and miles to go before we sleep. So it really is this Boston to Philadelphia model, from protest to progress, that we all have to pursue together. And it's about principles. The principles found in the Constitution are what will ultimately unite us, help us overcome the division within our nation today, and create better days for everyone in this extraordinary place that we call America. I'm Boyd Matheson. Thank you so much for joining us today on Sunday Edition. And as always, as you go out into the world today, make sure you see something that inspires, say something that uplifts, and do something today that'll make a difference. Music and the spoken word is next.